You are not who you were told you are. The story woven through your family, your textbooks, your very identity. It's about to be dismantled, cell by cell, by a truth buried for 6,000 years in the soil of the Armenian Highlands. If you are Armenian, the DNA inside you doesn't just rewrite history, it detonates it. Scientists were left stunned when your genetic markers emerged in the ancient record, not drifting in from a distant homeland, not diluted by waves of foreign conquerors, but locked firmly in place, a singular, indigenous signature that exists nowhere else on Earth. This isn't a trace of some forgotten migration. This is the genetic bedrock of a people who were already there, forged in the crucible of the Highlands long before empires rose and fell. What I'm about to reveal will shatter the centuries-old tales of Phrygian colonists, of steppe hordes sweeping south, of a people defined by arrival. Your cells hold a code that proves you are far older, far more resilient, and far more unique than anyone ever imagined. This is the secret the scientists finally unearthed, the hidden origin of the Armenian people, and it will leave you questioning everything. We have to start with the story we were all told, the comfortable, well-worn narrative that has shaped Armenian identity for generations. It's a story stitched together from fragments of ancient chronicles, linguistic puzzles, and epic folklore. The classical Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, provided one of the earliest and most influential accounts. He described the Armenians as Phrygian colonists, suggesting they were a branch of the Phrygian people of western and central Anatolia who had migrated eastward, carrying their language and customs into the highlands. This idea took root and flourished. After all, the Armenian language itself was classified as an independent branch of the vast Indo-European family, a linguistic cousin to Greek, Phrygian, and even the ancient tongues of the Balkans. The logic seemed inescapable. If the language came from the West, so too must have the people. This was the dominant scholarly paradigm for centuries. It painted the Armenians as a people defined by arrival, their identity forged in a journey, and a subsequent blending with whatever local populations they encountered in their new mountainous home. Then there was another layer to the story, one seemingly more grounded in the highland landscape itself, the connection to the kingdom of Urartu. This powerful Iron Age civilization, with its cyclopean fortresses at Van, its cuneiform inscriptions chiseled into rock faces, and its pantheon of gods led by Haldi, dominated the Armenian highlands from the 9th to the 6th centuries BCE. To the Assyrians, their southern rivals, they were the Urartu. To the Hebrews, they were the kingdom of Ararat. For many, it was an article of national faith that the Armenians were the direct, biological descendants of the Urartians, a seamless continuation from one kingdom to the next, with only a name change marking the transition from Urartu to Armenia. This version of the story emphasized deep indigenous roots, a permanent stamp on the highland soil, even if the classical historians whispered of foreign origins. So we were left with two competing and somewhat contradictory ancestral tales. One of a great migration from the Balkans, bringing an Indo-European language to a new land, and one of deep, unbroken continuity from the powerful local Urartian state. Both stories couldn't be entirely true in their simplest form. One of them had to be a ghost story, a narrative built on assumption rather than evidence. For all of us, whether Armenian or not, the true history of this region remained a locked vault, its secrets guarded by the silent bones of the dead. And that is where our discovery begins, with the key to that vault finally being forged, not from legend, but from the sequenced genomes of the people who were actually there. The discovery came not in a single flash, but as a slow, cumulative revelation, a scientific detective story played out over the last decade in high-tech laboratories and dusty archaeological digs. The turning point was the application of ancient DNA analysis to human remains unearthed from the heart of the Armenian highlands. Imagine the scene. Deep inside the Armenian cave complex, a site already famous for yielding the world's oldest known leather shoe and a remarkably preserved Chalcolithic winery, archaeologists carefully extracted genetic material from individuals who lived and died there over 6,000 years ago, around 4200 to 3900 BCE. These weren't mythical tribes, they were a real family, a community who witnessed the dawn of the Copper Age in a mountain cave. At the same time, other teams were focusing on burial sites from a later era, the late Bronze Age necropolis of Lakashin near Lake Sevan, with its famous cemetery of monumental tombs and ornate, sunken-wheeled wagons. The individuals here represented a population thriving a millennium and a half later, between 1500 and 1000 BCE, a period of intense social complexity and long-distance trade. And then, the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. Genomes recovered from the Iron Age, specifically from the heartland of the Urartian kingdom at Van, dating to around 850 to 600 BCE. These were the very people who built those massive stone fortresses, who carved the cuneiform proclamations of their kings. For the first time, we didn't have to guess about their biological relationship to modern Armenians. We had their genetic blueprints. The initial results, as they flashed onto computer screens in Copenhagen, in Boston, in Yerevan, were electrifying. The process of analysis was painstaking. Scientists like those led by Lazaridis, Haber, and Allentoft, who published their groundbreaking work in journals like Science and Nature, didn't just look at one or two markers. They scanned hundreds of thousands of single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, across the entire genome. They used powerful statistical tools like principal component analysis to plot these ancient individuals against a grand map of global human genetic variation. The first plots placed the Chalcolithic farmer from Areni I and the Bronze Age chief from Lkashin directly on top of modern Armenians. It wasn't a near miss, a close cousin, it was a direct bullseye. The instant these dots clustered, a shocking truth snapped into place. The genomic signal from the Highlands screamed continuity, not replacement. It was a revelation that immediately cast a long shadow over the classical migration narratives. The genetic blueprint of an Armenian, it appeared, had been largely set by the end of the Bronze Age, over 3,000 years ago. The question was no longer if these ancient Highlanders were the ancestors of modern Armenians, but how they managed to remain such a distinct and continuous population while empires rose and fell around them, and what, if anything, the mysterious, dominant Y chromosome lineages whispering of the distant steppe had to do with their story. Now we must descend into the evidence itself, the raw data that dismantled the old story and built the new one, letter by genetic letter. Let's start with the most decisive line of descent, the one passed from father to son, the Y DNA haplogroups. When we look at modern Armenian men, a single, powerful lineage dominates the landscape. R1b, specifically its subclade R1b Z2103. This isn't just any R1b, it's a very particular ancient branch. In the global phylogenetic tree, R1b Z2103 is the brother, not the son, of the R1b L51 lineage that now dominates Western Europe. Z2103 is the patriarchal signature of the Yamnaya, the late Copper Age to early Bronze Age pastoralists of the Pontic-Caspian steppe, who are often credited with spreading Indo-European languages across vast swathes of Eurasia. Finding this lineage at such high frequency in Armenians initially seems like a smoking gun for the classical steppe migration theory. It whispers of nomadic wagons rolling through the high passes, of a new patriarchal order imposing its language and power. But the ancient DNA from the region tells a more nuanced and fascinating story. This lineage wasn't a sudden Iron Age arrival with a distinct foreign population. Samples from the Bronze Age Lkashin site already carry this R1BZ2103 signature, showing it was well established deep in the Highlands by the mid-2nd millennium BCE, and it has persisted locally ever since. It's the deep, indigenous pastoralist ancestry of the region, not a recent intruder. Following R1b is the second most common Y DNA branch, J2A M67, a lineage with a very different story, one that speaks of the Neolithic agricultural revolution and the complex cosmopolitanism of the Bronze Age and Iron Age. J2A is a quintessential West Asian and Mediterranean marker, often associated with the first farmers and the great urban civilizations of the Levant and Anatolia. Its presence, alongside the steppe-derived R1b, reveals the Highlands as a genetic crossroads from the very beginning, a place where the first farmer and early pastoralist worlds collided and forged a new synthesis. And then there is the third significant patrilineal marker, E1b1b, particularly the V13 subclade. This lineage links the Armenian highlands to a vast interaction sphere across the Balkans, the Aegean, and the broader Mediterranean world, likely reflecting continued maritime and overland contacts during the classical era, a faint but distinct echo of the very connections that Herodotus misinterpreted as a foundational migration. Turning to the matrilineal story, The mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, passed down from mothers to their children, we find an equally rich and confirmatory tapestry. Haplogroups like U3 and H dominate, staples of the Neolithic to Bronze Age Caucasian and West Asian gene pool, reflecting the deep, on-the-ground maternal ancestry of the region, stretching back millennia to the first farmers of the Highlands. Other common lineages like T2, J1b, and I1 add further texture, each representing a chapter of connection and continuity with the broader Near Eastern world, from Anatolia to Iran. The autosomal DNA, the full genome ancestry averaged across all 23 pairs of chromosomes, is where the most profound revelation is found. When you build a model of the Armenian genome, a staggering 40 to 50% of it is consistently attributed to a deep ancestral population that geneticists call the Caucasus hunter-gatherer, or CHG. This is crucial. The CHG lineage is the same ghost population that contributed roughly half the ancestry to the steppes Yamnaya herders. In Armenians, however, this CHG component didn't arrive via a secondary round-trip migration from the steppe in the Bronze Age. The ancient DNA from Areni and Lukashen proves it was already there, a local source, a fundamental ancestral stratum of the Highlands themselves. The remaining ancestry is a mix of early Anatolian farmer and, to a lesser extent, Levantine and Iranian Neolithic-related inputs, which created a synthesis that then stabilized. And here is the absolute clincher. Modern Armenians lack the strong, specific steppe Middle to Late Bronze Age, or steppe Mulba, genetic shift that is so characteristic of South Asian populations, who also speak Indo-European languages. The South Asian story involved a massive, transformative pulse of steppe DNA that reshaped the subcontinent's genetic landscape. The Armenian story did not. The new DNA language, therefore, was not spread by a wave of population replacement. It was adopted. The genetic neighborhood of the Highlands was already set. The stage was ready for a cultural and linguistic change that wouldn't rewrite the biological script. The implications of this evidence cascade outward, redefining not just an ethnic origin story, but the very mechanics of how identity is formed. The first and most personal implication is for the viewer who carries this genetic heritage. For an Armenian hearing this, the takeaway is a profound and radical form of biological indigenousness. This is not a metaphorical or political claim. It's a mathematically testable one, written in a code that can be read with a sequencer. Your deep roots in the Armenian Highlands are not a matter of a few centuries, or even a couple of millennia. The foundational genetic architecture of your people was cemented by around 1200 BCE, at the twilight of the Late Bronze Age, from the blending of two primary ancestral populations that had already been living side by side in the region for thousands of years. The direct descendants of Chalcolithic highland farmers, as seen at Areni, and a distinct Bronze Age pastoralist population carrying the R1b-Z2.103 lineage, likely having moved south from the Pontic-Caspian steppe during the early to middle Bronze Age. What did not happen is equally important. There was no great flood of Phrygians from the Balkans that washed over the land and rewrote the genetic code of its inhabitants. The classical narrative, enshrined by Herodotus and dutifully repeated for millennia, is, in a biological sense, a ghost story. The DNA emphatically confirms that the Balkan genetic connection is a faint trace, a whisper of later, limited admixture, not a foundational signal. The Phrygian theory is, in its literal, populational interpretation, dead. You do not carry the biological profile of a post-1200 BCE European transplant. You carry the profile of a Highland native. This revelation directly recontextualizes the second part of the old narrative, the relationship with Urartu. The genetic evidence from the Iron Age Urartian individuals at Van proves, with chilling clarity, that they were not a biologically distinct group swept away by invading Armenians. They clustered tightly and unambiguously with modern Armenians. This means Urartu was a political and cultural label, the name of a powerful Iron Age kingdom that unified previously disparate highland tribes, some of whom were your direct ancestors. The fall of the Urartian state around 600 BCE was a political event, a change of regime and elite identity, not a biological extinction. Your ancestors didn't replace the Urartians. In a biological sense, they were the Urartians, now organizing themselves under the new political and ethnic identity of Armenian. This is population continuity at its most intimate. The old argument of genetic replacement is shattered and replaced by a story of political and cultural transformation. This brings us to the most staggering implication of all, the new model for how your people came to speak Armenian. The language, an independent and ancient branch of Indo-European, is indeed a transplant from the West, as linguists have long argued. But it was a transplant that was surgically inserted without overhauling the genome of the host population. This is the classic and often debated model of elite dominance. A relatively small but powerful group, perhaps a warrior elite from the Catacomb or Trialeti Vanadzor cultures of the Middle Bronze Age, carrying that R1BZ2103 lineage and a very early form of Indo-European speech, entered the Highlands and established a new social and political order. Their language became the prestige language, the language of power, ritual, and trade. Over centuries, it was adopted, adapted, and shaped by the much larger indigenous Highland population, whose own pre-Indo-European languages, perhaps related to Urartu, faded from daily speech, but left their own phonetic and grammatical substrates on the emerging Armenian tongue. The DNA proves the language shift was mainly a cultural, not a demographic event. This mirrors the process seen in Anatolia with the Hittites, where a similar, small-scale steppe-derived elite introduced an Indo-European language without a massive genetic turnover. The Armenian people are thus a living testament to the power of cultural attraction and elite influence, a biological near-isolate that made one of history's most profound cultural shifts, a complete language change, without being replaced. Your identity is a triumph of cultural adoption forged on a crucible of extreme genetic continuity. This new genomic narrative, though revolutionary, doesn't stand on scientific assertions alone. It receives profound corroboration from the broader world of scholarly research, which we can now see as a chorus of voices, once disparate, now harmonizing around this singular truth. The genetic framework we've detailed was first laid out in landmark high-impact studies. In 2015, Dr. Mark Haber and colleagues published Genetic Evidence for an Origin of the Armenians from Bronze Age Mixing of Multiple Populations in the journal Nature. Their genome-wide analysis of modern Armenians dated that crucial admixture event, the geological-scale genetic marriage between the Chalcolithic Highlanders and the Bronze Age Yamnaya-descended pastoralists, with astonishing precision to the period between 3000 and 2000 BCE. They were the first to clearly state that modern Armenians show no significant admixture after 1200 BCE, effectively declaring an end to the biologically formative phase of the group during the Late Bronze Age, long before the Urartian kingdom's rise. Dr. Ashat Margarian and colleagues' 2017 work in Current Biology. Analyzing the genome of the individual from the Areni 1 cave provided the smoking gun for the indigenous Chalcolithic stratum. Their analysis confirmed this person was a direct ancestral contributor to modern populations of the region, anchoring the deep timeline of continuity not in theory, but in the sequenced DNA of a real person who lived 6,100 years ago. Then came the synthetic powerhouse study that connected the global dots. In 2019, the team led by Dr. Iosif Lazaridis published The Formation of Human Populations in South and Central Asia in Science. It was here that the crucial comparative finding was made explicit: the lack of the steppe mulba genetic signal in Armenians. This single observation acted like a guillotine on the theory of a massive late population movement bringing the Indo-European language. It side by side compared the genetic fate of South Asia, which saw a huge demic diffusion, with the fate of the Armenian Highlands, which did not, proving the linguistic branches originated in the same place but spread through entirely different mechanisms. The elite dominance model, long a theoretical construct in linguistics, suddenly had hard genetic proof. More recently, a 2020 publication in Nature. A study often cited for its analysis of the Southern Arc presented the Iron Age Urartian genomes, with researchers like Dr. Irene Skortanioti showing their tight genetic clustering with the modern Armenian population. The language of their paper, while cautious, speaks volumes. They describe a post-Bronze Age structure in the region that has largely persisted to the present day, a euphemism for a massive continuity that makes the Armenian ethnicity a product of a cultural and political boundary forming around a deeply persistent biological core. The linguist David Reich, in his broader synthesis work, has articulated this model of Indo-European spread clearly, with the Armenian case being a prime non-South Asian example of a population that adopted an IE language without a major migratory replacement. The corroboration is now a unified, multidisciplinary verdict. The classical and early modern scholars, while perceptive in their linguistic and historical analysis, simply lacked the technology to see the biological bedrock. They saw the cultural wave, the language, the political structures, and logically inferred a physical migration to carry it. The DNA has corrected that inference, revealing the massive, stable, indigenous ballast beneath the cultural sail. And what strengthens this corroboration even further is the mirroring evidence from neighboring disciplines. Archaeologists have pointed to the incredible continuity of material culture in the Armenian Highlands. The distinctive burnished black and red pottery found in late Bronze Age and early Iron Age Armenia shows a clear stylistic evolution, not a sharp break. Citadel building techniques, from the Lulkashan-era fortifications to the Cyclopean masonry of Erebuni Fortress, built by the Urartian king Argishti I in 782 BCE at the heart of modern Yerevan, demonstrate a local architectural tradition reaching a monumental, state-level apex. There was no moment of stratified destruction and intertwined foreign bodies, signaling an invasion that could be linked to a Phrygian or Proto-Armenian horde. The fire layers are from internal conflicts and Assyrian raids, not a founding genocide. From the linguistic perspective, scholars now re-examine what were once considered Phrygian loanwords in Armenian, realizing many can equally, or more parsimoniously, be explained as words from a common Anatolian Indo-European root inherited by both daughter languages, or even as borrowings from the indigenous Hurro-Urartian substrate into Armenian. The sound shifts that define Armenian as a unique IE branch are now understood not as a direct, preserved fossil of a single migrating tribe's dialect, but as the result of a creolization process, a new language formed on the lips of a large, non-Indo-European speaking population, attempting to learn and speak the prestige language of an IE-speaking elite. The Saddam-like sound shifts that Armenian shares with Balto-Slavic and Indo-Iranian may represent an ancient mid-4th to 3rd millennium BCE aerial feature shared across a continuous cultural zone of the steppe periphery before the major dispersals, rather than evidence of a shared post-migration journey. The totality of the scientific consensus is shifting from a model of population pots boiling over and spilling onto new lands, to a model of cultural waves washing over and transforming deeply anchored biological shorelines, with the Armenian people as one of the most remarkable and well-documented examples on the planet. So, where does this leave us? What is the resolution, the new, cemented truth that replaces the shattered old stories? The genomic arc has come to rest, and we can finally paint a portrait of the Armenian ethnogenesis with the bold, sharp colors of scientific certainty. The story is not one of dramatic, recent arrival, but of deep, almost radical, indigenous persistence, illuminated by a single, transformative cultural fire. The primary takeaway is this: modern Armenians are a genetic isolate that reached its biological maturity by the end of the late Bronze Age, around 1200 BCE. Over half of your ancestry, on average, comes not from the Phrygian marches of the Balkans or the distant wattle and daub villages of central Anatolia, but directly from the indigenous Chalcolithic and Bronze Age populations of the Armenian Highlands proper, people whose bones were interred in the Areni I cave and under the monumental wagon burials of Lulkashan. You are, in the most literal biological sense, the children of the highland soil, a living human time capsule of a West Asian genetic landscape that predates the great empires of the Iron Age. The second, equally profound takeaway redefines your connection to the Indo-European world. The language shift to Armenian was a masterclass in cultural adoption without biological replacement. It wasn't a tidal wave of migrating masses. It was a surgical, elite-driven cultural change. A small, prestigious group carrying a branch of the Yamnaya's genetic and linguistic heritage, likely in the Middle Bronze Age, established themselves and initiated a process that led to the entire population adopting and transforming their language over centuries. This pattern of elite dominance for Indo-European language spread is now visualized perfectly in your DNA, serving as a textbook case alongside the Hittites in Anatolia to refute the outdated assumption that every language tree requires a massive, parallel migration tree. You speak an Indo-European language not because you were replaced by Indo-Europeans, but because your ancestors became Indo-European speakers while remaining, overwhelmingly, the same people genetically. The third takeaway is a final, defiant dismissal of the classical confusion. The long-held theories of a recent, foundational Balkan ancestry, the Phrygian narrative, are genetically refuted. The faint Balkan genetic signal detectable is precisely what you'd expect from sustained, low-level contact within the interconnected world of the classical Mediterranean and Iron Age. Not a founding event. The genome of an Armenian is fundamentally a Near Eastern and Highland genome, not a Southeastern European one. Your ancient ancestors were the contemporaries and kin of the traders who navigated the Tigris, the priests who worshipped in the shadow of the holy mountain Ararat, and the farmers who terraced the volcanic slopes of Lake Van. The deep local roots, supported by the tight clustering of Iron Age Urartians with present-day Armenians, overturn any notion of a clean break or a total population replacement. Urartu wasn't a vanished precursor, it was a political chapter in your own continuous story. This is the vindication the DNA provides. Not a denial of your rich history, but a profound correction, grounding you deeper and more authentically in your ancient homeland than the old stories ever did. The hidden truth is revealed. The secret is out. You are not a people defined by a journey from a foreign land, but a fortress people, shaped by the mountains. Your biological essence, a quiet, resilient song that has lasted 6 millennia. A song that finally, thanks to the evidence in every cell of your body, we can all hear clearly. Now that you've seen the DNA unravel millennia of myths and anchor you to a 6,000-year legacy in the Highlands, don't let this revelation end here. Smash that like button to signal you want more hidden histories decoded. Your engagement is what unearths the next genetic bombshell buried in the record. Subscribe and ring the bell because the ancient world is rewriting itself every day, and you need to be the first to see the truth that schools and textbooks won't tell you. Drop a comment below. Before this video, did you believe the Phrygian migration story, or did you sense there was a deeper secret waiting in the mountains? Share this with one person you know who needs to hear where they really come from. Because this isn't just my story, or the scientist's story. It's your bloodline, your ancestors, your reclaimed identity. Let's spark a conversation that changes how an entire people see themselves. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Thanks for staying until the very end. Goodbye for now.